I guess I'll just speak louder this morning. Pastor Dan started out with the 10 Commandments. And whenever he started with the 10 Commandments, he started out the entire series saying, I don't need another rule to follow. My life is already so crowded, and I have so many things that I must do and not do in the list already. He said, I don't need another one. And we are at that point again today. Here is yet another one of the checkbox for those people who enjoy checking off the list and checking off the boxes, saying, I have done this or I have not done that, so that I'm good with that. Here we are again in Exodus chapter 20. And we pick up in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14, and this is also another one of those memory verses that you can use whenever you're caught off guard and somebody says, how many Bible verses can you quote for me off the top of your head? And you know, Dan said last week, Jesus wept and do not murder. This one goes right in there with that, do not commit adultery. You can keep that one up there and remember it easily. It's short. But did you know that in our society, just here in the United States alone, not throughout the world, but here in the United States, there are over 20 sexually transmitted diseases affecting 13 million people just in the United States? The Center for Disease Control estimates that by the year 2025, 40% of all men in the United States and 50% of all women in the United States will be infected with some sexually transmitted disease. You shall not commit adultery. We look at that and we say, we know that. That's obvious. We can look at the results of what adultery does as far as going outside of the marriage and spreading disease, going outside of the marriage and destroying marriages. We know those things. They're obvious. And yet God felt the need to give this as one of those laws to tell us, as if we didn't obviously know that. And then you look at our culture and you look at the statistics, and even though we know it, we see the destruction throughout the nation. Then Jesus comes along, just like Pastor Dan said last week, and he makes the law even more difficult. He comes along in Matthew chapter 5, and in Matthew chapter 5, he proceeds to tell us, starting in verse 27, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so we go from the act to the thought life, the thought process. And now we go from the checking off the box of I have not done this to does anybody know that I've thought about that? Did anybody see that thought flip through my mind? And so then we go into how do we control our thoughts and how do we control our actions, and it becomes much more difficult. And if I think you look at the commandments, if you go back where they started, God said he was a jealous God. And he said that we should have no other gods before him. And if you go back and you look in Genesis at the creation, when man was in the garden and he had relationship with God, I think if we look at the relationship, we'll understand. We'll be able to follow a little better. God is all about the relationship. God really, he gave these laws, and he gave the thou shalt not commit adultery, but it wasn't about the checklist. It was about the relationship. Whenever he said, you shall have no other gods before me, it wasn't about the checklist. It was about the relationship. God longs for us to be in relationship with him in a pure way. And that just transfers over into all of our other relationships. God longs for us to be in relationship with one another in a pure way. God created family, and he put family together, and he wants the family to be in relationship with one another in a pure way. God looks through history, and he knows the destruction of broken relationships. And we've all been there. We've all been in that relationship that has been broken for whatever reason, and the pain that it brings. But the joy that a full relationship brings. And so God here, he tells man, he gives us the information to know, do not commit adultery. Do not break the bond within marriage. I gave you the statistics of the sexually transmitted diseases, but the statistics of broken family throughout the United States. The statistics of non-existent dysfunctional family throughout the United States is too difficult. If you look across our nation today, you see the suffering from the lack of family. You see the suffering from the lack of the functional love within the family, the pure relationship. You see the children that are growing up without that love because the relationships have been broken, because the family has been torn apart, or the family was never put together properly from the start. Jesus says that in our thought life, if we look to lust, and we go back and we look at the story of David, a man after God's own heart, and David, he sends his general out to war. If you go back and you look at the scripture there, when it talks about David and Bathsheba, David started off on the wrong foot. It was the time when kings went out to war, and David didn't go. He stayed at home in the palace, and he sent his generals out to war. And he stayed at home, and in the night he was up walking around looking, and he looked at Bathsheba. And then he went from looking to gathering information. And he went from gathering information to having her brought in. And then that led from adultery to murder and to lying, and David he bundled it all together. And we see that take place in our society today. Once we start down that pathway, once we start down that road, the guilt drives us to cover it somehow. And what we end up doing is heaping more guilt on ourselves. God didn't give us the law so that we could suffer from the weight of guilt. God gave us the law so that we would know there is a way to destroy what he has designed. There is a way that is perfect, and then there is a way that is imperfect. Here Jesus says that with our thought life, and we look and we think, as long as I have not done this. And I've had people tell me, Pastor, I haven't done this thing and I haven't done that thing, and I think of myself as a pretty good person. I compare myself to others around, and I compare myself to people in the church, and I know so-and-so, and they go to church, and they've done this. And I know so-and-so, and they go to church, and they've done that. But then whenever you say, well, have you thought about it? It's kind of like the rich young ruler then. They just have to turn and walk away. Because thought life's a little more difficult to control. Because nobody else is watching it. We may be able to contain our actions because we are worried about what people will think if they see us do something. But when we know that they can't see our thoughts, where do we go? What do we do? This morning, right here, sitting here, we're all here to worship, right? That's what we're here for. We're here to worship the Lord our God and lift his name on high. And yet, if on these screens up here we could project the thoughts, I bet we'd have a much smaller crowd. If you thought whenever you walked through those doors, whatever you were thinking would be projected for everybody to see, it would change. And so that thought life becomes much more difficult to deal with because you can sit right here in the midst of worship and being doing all sorts of things that we're not supposed to do. And so Jesus says if a man look to lust at a woman, then he has committed adultery with her in his heart already. And so how do we guard against that? It's the relationship. The relationship. That relationship with the Lord God. That relationship that keeps our thought life on target, that commitment, that covenant relationship that we have with him. And then that transfers over into the marriage, that transfers over into the family if we are committed covenant relationship with one another. It changes how we think about things. When we remember the covenant, when we remember the commitment, the problem with adultery is one of those things that is done either in emotion or in entitlement. I think I deserve, or I think I should have. But what we forget at those moments, what we follow is that emotion and that desire, and we forget that covenant. We forget that commitment because we have to. We can't mesh the two of those together. And so that covenant relationship that God has put in place with us, and that covenant relationship that he has built within the family, within the marriage, was there to protect us so that we don't end up breaking the rules. That relationship, if it's in the right point, if the relationship is growing, then we're not tempted like we would be when we're out of relationship or when the relationship is stagnant and broken. And one of the things that the Lord looks at here whenever he puts this law into effect is he realizes the state of the family. As pastor, and the unfortunate opportunities of counseling that I have had in dealing with adultery, the family suffers greatly. And adultery is not the cardinal sin, and family can heal, but the suffering is still there. And God looks and he sees we can cause ourselves so much more damage whenever we disobey. So he gives us that warning. And then God gives us the example to follow. He shows us what it looks like, the relationship that he has with us. If you look over into Revelation, you see that it is granted unto the bride to be able to wear white, the color of purity, at the marriage of the Lamb. And it's not by anything that the bride, who is us, the church, has done, because we have committed adultery. We have put other gods before God. We have broken all of the laws and the rules, and yet and still he loves so greatly. He provided for our purity. What a relationship. What a love. And that's the relationship he longs for us to have with him. And that's the relationship that he longs for us to have with one another. The relationship of a great and sacrificial love. What is it that we're willing to sacrifice for family? Because whenever we look at adultery, what we find is we are willing to sacrifice great deals for our own pleasure and our own desires. 13 million people just in the United States. What are we willing to sacrifice for the relationship of covenant that God has placed us in? What are we willing to sacrifice? What is it worth? God didn't make it easy for us to follow the Ten Commandments because they touch on all of those things that we are tempted to do. You know, he could have picked easier ones, right? He could have said, well, these are going to be the top 10 laws that I'm going to give you because I know you can follow them. But he didn't. He gave us the ones that he knew we couldn't follow. So we would know that we can only do it through him. We would know there's no way that we can ever measure up in our marriages, in our families. You know, how many of us as parents wish there was some sort of handbook that came with the children? Here are their buttons, here are how you operate them, here are the things you don't do and the things that you do. How many of us wish that when we were married, our pastor, whoever it was that pronounced the vows, would have handed us a handbook and said, this is the way marriage works. Year 1. Year 2, week 3. This is what you do, this is how you do it, this is why you do it, and this will work this way. This is the result of, wait a minute, God did all that. He gave us that instruction manual, and he said, if you do these things, you will have troubles. If you do these things, you will have destruction. And on the other hand, if you do these things, if you love me, if you serve me, if you follow me, if you obey me, if you love others as you love yourself, if you covenant together and keep pure, you will have life. That's what his book says. And yet we choose to do the opposite over and over and over. And so when Jesus comes, God has already given the 10 Commandments. And I want you to understand that the 10 Commandments, they knew them in Jesus' day. It wasn't something that Jesus was pulling up that they would have forgotten. He was speaking to a group of people that could have quoted them. Unfortunately today, here in our culture, if you ask most churchgoers, could you name the 10 Commandments? Usually you get 4 or 5. And then they say, well, you know, what are the rest of those? I know them. I remember learning them in Sunday school, but I can't think of them. Jesus was talking to a crowd that would have known the 10 Commandments. And when he says, if you have thought it, you've done it, that was new to them. Because they thought they were protected as long as they just hadn't followed through. They thought the relationship was okay as long as they didn't say it. How many of us are there? Yeah, I wanted to say that to them. I wanted to do that, but I didn't. And Christ said, the relationship is still broken because it's broken in our hearts. It's not just a mind thing. It's not just a body, physical thing. It's a heart relationship. We don't need another rule to follow. What we need is a relationship with our Lord. What we need is a covenant, commitment relationship. What we need is covenant relationships with one another, within our marriages, within our families. What we need is a committed relationship within our body. It's what we all long for. We all long for that relationship that we can trust, that we can hold on to, that we know no matter what, it's still there and it's still strong. That's what we really want. Why then are we not being willing to be the one who is committed, who is covenanted? Not just with our actions, but even with our mind, all the way clear to our hearts. It's what God requires. It's what he asks for. It's the least that we can do because it is exactly what he has given to us. Shall not commit adultery. We all know that. We know that commandment. In fact, that's one of the few that we could name. In fact, there are non-church people that can name that one. They know it's wrong. They know that it's damaging. But we just can't help ourselves if we're not in that relationship. Ever wonder why it is that we do the things we know we shouldn't do? We're not committed to the relationship. We're not covenanted to the relationship. God has committed himself to us so that he can teach us, so that he can show us what true love looks like. And we all want that true love. There's movies about it. There's songs about it. We talk about it. We even celebrate it in February. But it's so far from our hearts so often. It's so hard for us to do. But God has made a way. God made a way through Christ for us to be covenanted to him, for us to be committed to him. And he loves us so much that if we seek him, he will give us the ability to live in that relationship with him. What a great and joyous thought. When we look around us and we see how bad things are and how everything falls apart around us, we can be in the midst of the joy of that relationship with him, not because of me, but because of him. Because of his love. Because he already knew I was broken. As we come to this time today, if you need to come and join the church, or you need to come and make a commitment to Christ because you don't have that relationship or your relationship is broken, encourage you to come and do that at this time as we sing one more song.